My sister told me I would be nothing without our family. She said it at the Thanksgiving table in front of my parents, with a glass of Chardonnay in her hand and a smile that did not waver once. I did not argue. I picked up my napkin, folded it, and set it beside my plate. Then I left. That was 10 years ago. Last Tuesday, I sat at the head of a conference table on the 31st floor of a building I own a stake in, reviewing applications for a $180, zero zone a year position at the company I built from nothing. I turned to the third folder. The name on the resume read, Diana Mercer. I recognized the birthday, the old Greenwich address, the handwriting style on the cover letter that she had never quite grown out of. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been told you would amount to nothing and quietly proved every single one of them wrong. I grew up in a house that had too many rooms and not enough honesty. My father, Robert Collins, built his career as a commodities broker in the 90s when that still meant something. When you could walk onto a trading floor in a good suit and come home with a check that made your neighbors quiet. By the time I was 7, we had a colonial on 4 acres in Greenwich, Connecticut, a membership at Beacon Hill Country Club, and a cleaning woman named Rosa who came on Tuesdays and Thursdays and always smelled like lavender soap. From the outside, we were a family that had figured something out. From the inside, we had a system. And like most systems built inside families, it was never written down anywhere. You just learned it. Deanna was 4 years older than me, and she had arrived first, which in our house counted for everything. She had my mother's cheekbones and my father's confidence, and she knew how to work a room before she could drive. At dinner parties, she refilled wine glasses without being asked. She remembered the names of my father's clients' wives. She laughed at the right moments. My parents watched her do these things with a particular kind of satisfaction, the way people look at a habit they taught a child that turned out better than expected. I was different, and I knew it early. I did not care about the dinner parties. I cared about the numbers. When I was 10, I found a copy of my father's annual performance report in his home office. He had left it on the desk, which he would not have done if he had known I would read it. I read the whole thing. I did not understand all of it, but I understood enough to know that certain columns mattered more than others, and that the story those columns told was not always the story being spoken out loud at the table. My father caught me with it. He did not get angry. He just took it from my hands, said, "That's not for you," and went back to his study. Diana would not have touched that report. Diana was not interested in what was real. She was interested in what looked good, and in our family, those two things were rarely the same. By the time I was in high school, the structure of our household was fixed and everyone had accepted their place in it. Diana was the one my parents bragged about at the club. She was the one who got the car for her 16th birthday and the graduation trip to Europe and the apartment deposit when she moved to the city after college. I was the one who got the tuition, state school, not the small liberal arts college I had actually wanted, and a handshake at the door when I left for freshman year, with 2 bags and a used laptop. I do not say this with bitterness anymore. I said it with bitterness for a long time, but I have been in enough boardrooms now to know that resentment is expensive. You burn calories carrying it around that you could spend on something that compounds. What I will say is this. I watched. I watched how money moved in that house and how decisions got made and whose opinion was consulted and whose was not. I watched my father extend credit to Diana's ideas the way a bank extends credit to a customer with a long history, automatically, without much review. And I watched the way he looked at my ideas, which was the way you look at a menu item you have never tried and do not intend to. I started working at 16. Not because we needed the money. We did not. But because I needed to understand something that the house on 4 acres was not going to teach me. I took a job at a small accounting firm in Stamford, answering phones and folders for $11 an hour. Within 4 months, I was doing basic bookkeeping. Within a year, the owner, a quiet man named Gerald Fitch, who wore the same brown cardigan every day, let me sit in on client calls. Gerald Fitch was the first person who looked into my brain and did not seem confused by what he found there. He told me once, near the end of my second summer working for him, that I had better instincts for pattern recognition than most of the associates he had hired straight out of accounting programs. He said it flatly, the way you say something that is just true, not as a compliment designed to motivate. I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count since then. I went to Yukon on a partial scholarship and studied finance. I worked 20 hours a week all 4 years. I graduated with a 3.9 and $11,000 in savings and no credit card debt, which in my friend group at the time made me unusual. Diana, by then, was living in a two-bedroom in the West Village, working at a mid-sized PR agency and telling anyone who would listen that she was going to start her own firm within 2 years. My parents talked about Diana's plan at every family dinner. They talked about it the way people talk about a film they are looking forward to, with anticipation, with ownership, as if the outcome reflected something about them. Nobody asked me what my plan was. I had one. I just did not share it yet. The Thanksgiving I was 22 years old, my mother made her standing rib roast. She made it every year. And every year the house smelled the same from the moment you walked in. Rosemary, and rendered fat, and the particular warmth of a kitchen that had been running since morning. There were candles on the sideboard, and the good china and a centerpiece Diana had put together from branches she cut in the backyard. It looked like something out of a catalog. My mother told her so 3 times before we sat down. There were 8 of us at the table that year. My parents, Diana's boyfriend at the time, a corporate attorney named Patrick who shook hands too firmly and spoke mostly to my father, my mother's sister Carol and her husband, and me. I had driven up from Stamford alone. I had a plan for what I wanted to say that evening, and I had been rehearsing it in the car for 45 minutes. I waited until the plates were cleared and the wine had been refilled, and the conversation had softened the way it does after a good meal. My father was relaxed. My mother was laughing at something Carol had said. It felt like the right moment. I said I had something I wanted to share with the family. Everyone turned. I had spent 14 months building a business plan for a boutique financial advisory firm targeting mid-size family offices in Connecticut and Westchester. I had done the market analysis. I had the competitive landscape mapped out. I had a list of 12 potential first clients, 3 of whom I had already had preliminary conversations with through Gerald Fitch's network. I was not asking for an investment. I was asking for a loan, $15,000 to cover 6 months of LLC registration, licensing fees, liability insurance, and a basic website. I had a repayment schedule already drafted. I slid a printed copy across the table to my father. He picked it up. He looked at it for about 30 seconds. Then he set it down and looked at Diana. I watched that happen. I watched my father's eyes leave my document and move to my sister's face, as if he needed to check something before he answered me. Diana was already smiling. She said, and I remember this with the kind of precision you only develop for moments that change you. Dad, tell her about the thing. My father cleared his throat. He said that actually, the timing was interesting, because he and my mother had been meaning to make an announcement this evening. He said that they had decided to provide Diana with startup capital to launch her own public relations firm. $200,000, structured as a gift, not a loan. He said Diana had a real gift for relationships, and that PR was a people business, and that he believed in her instincts. My mother was beaming. Diana set her wine glass down and pressed both hands flat on the table, like she was steadying herself from joy. Patrick said, "That's incredible. She's going to be extraordinary." The table applauded. Aunt Carol said it was wonderful. My father looked pleased with himself in the way he only did when he felt he had done something generous. I sat with my printed business plan in front of me and did not move. After a moment, my father looked at me. Not unkindly. He said the timing just wasn't right on my end, that starting a financial firm required more than a plan, that maybe in a few years when I had more experience. He trailed off. He picked up his wine. I asked him directly. The answer was no. He said yes. The answer was no. I folded the business plan once, lengthwise, and set it beside my plate. Diana looked at me from across the table. She had the expression of someone who has won something they were not sure they wanted until the moment they got it. Then she said it. She said it with the Chardonnay in her hand, and the candlelight making her look like a painting of herself. "Haley, you'll be nothing without this family. You know that, right?" She said it lightly, like it was obvious, like she was doing me a favor by telling me. Nobody at the table corrected her. My mother looked at her centerpiece. Aunt Carol reached for the bread. Patrick swirled his wine. My father said nothing. I picked up my napkin. I folded it into a neat square. I placed it to the left of my empty plate, which is where it had started the evening. Then I pushed my chair back and stood up. I said, "Thank you for dinner, Mom." The roast was perfect. I got my coat from the closet. I walked out to my car. I sat in the driveway for 4 minutes with the heat running, looking at the front of the house. The lights in the windows, the shadows of people moving inside, the wreath on the door my mother had hung the week before. Then I backed out and drove to Stamford and did not go back, not for Christmas that year. Not for the next one. My mother called. I answered sometimes. My father sent a card on my birthday in February. Diana did not contact me at all, which was the most honest thing she had done in years. I had $15,000 in savings, a business plan with a crease down the middle, and the clearest head I had ever had in my life. I went home, made a pot of coffee, and opened my laptop. The room I rented in Stamford cost $620 a month. It was on the second floor of a narrow house owned by a retired postal worker named Edmund, who kept a jar of hard candies on the kitchen counter and watched the evening news at full volume every night at 6:30. The room had one window that faced a parking lot, a radiator that clicked for 20 minutes before it produced any actual heat, and exactly enough space for a full bed, a desk, and a bookshelf I assembled myself from a flat-pack box and 3 YouTube tutorials. I loved that room in a way I did not fully understand until years later. I think what I loved was that everything in it was mine. Not mine because someone had given it to me or assigned it to me or decided I deserved it. Mine because I had earned the exact amount of money required to pay for it and had handed that money to Edmund on the first of every month in a white envelope. There was a clarity to that transition that the house in Greenwich had never offered me. I gave myself 1 week after Thanksgiving to be still. I ran every morning. I cooked simple things. I reread the business plan 3 times and made notes in the margins. On the 7th day, I opened a new document and started over from the first line. The original plan had been built around a version of me that still needed something from my family, their network, their credibility, their name. I could see that clearly now, the way you can see the shape of something only after you have stepped away from it. The new plan was built around a version of me that needed nothing from anyone, except the willingness to work longer than the next person. I registered Collins Meridian Advisors, LLC, in the state of Connecticut on a Tuesday morning in February. I chose the name deliberately. Collins was my mother's maiden name, which she had kept professionally. Meridian because it means the highest point, the moment just before the descent, the top of the arc. I was 22 years old, and I chose that name because I intended to get somewhere, and I intended to know it when I arrived. The first 18 months were the kind of hard that does not make for a good story in the moment, but becomes the foundation of every story you tell afterward. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously for the first 8 months. I kept my position at Gerald Fitch's firm, which had by then grown to include a small advisory practice. I took on freelance bookkeeping for 4 small businesses I found through a local Chamber of Commerce listing. And I waited tables 3 nights a week at an Italian restaurant in downtown Stamford, where the owner, a large patient man named Vincent, let me pick up extra shifts when I needed them. I slept 6 hours a night. I did not go out. I did not date. I tracked every dollar I spent in a spreadsheet that I updated every Sunday evening, with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between where I was and where I was going was entirely a function of how well I managed the distance between those 2 columns. By the end of month 8, I had saved $41,000. I gave my notice at the restaurant first. Vincent shook my hand and told me to come back and eat for free any time, which I did twice, over the next several years, because I liked him, and because I do not forget people who were decent to me when I was nobody. Then I gave notice at the freelance accounts, one by one, and referred each client to a young bookkeeper I had met through a networking event. A woman named Priya who was just starting out and needed the work and who later sent me a bottle of wine and a handwritten note when her business hit its first 6 figures. I kept the position at Gerald's firm and shifted my hours to part-time. Gerald did not ask many questions. He was not a man who needed things explained to him. In the spring of that year, I filed for my Series 65 license and studied for it the way I had studied for nothing in college, with the kind of focused attention that comes from understanding exactly what is at stake. I passed on the first attempt with a score that put me in the 91st percentile. I printed the certificate and taped it to the wall above my desk, next to the window that faced the parking lot. I began making calls. Not cold calls, exactly. Gerald had given me 3 names, former clients of his who had moved on to larger firms, and whom he believed were not entirely satisfied with what they had found there. He gave me the names without fanfare. just wrote them on a piece of paper, and handed it across the desk one afternoon and said, "These are good people. Be straightforward with them." I was straightforward. I told each of them exactly what I was building, what I could offer, what I could not yet offer, and what I believed the difference would be in 18 months. I did not oversell. I did not use language designed to impress. I used numbers because numbers are the one form of honesty that cannot be softened by tone of voice. The first two said no, politely, and wished me well. The third was a man named Harrison Welch, who managed a family office out of Westport and who had been with his current advisory firm for 6 years and was, as he put it during our second phone call, tired of being handled. Harrison Welch became my first client. The retainer was $4,200 a month. I remember the exact figure because I sat with the signed agreement in my hands for a long time after the call ended, in that room above the parking lot, with the radiator clicking and the evening coming in gray through the window. And I thought about the Thanksgiving table and the folded business plan and the sound of Diana's voice saying what it had said. I did not feel triumphant. Not yet. I felt like I had found the first foothold on something very tall, and that the only question now was whether I had the endurance to keep climbing. I did. The contract that changed everything came in on a Wednesday afternoon in October, 3 years after I had driven out of my parents' driveway and not looked back. I was sitting at a desk that was no longer in the room above the parking lot. I had moved 6 months earlier into a small office suite on the fourth floor of a building on Atlantic Street in Stamford. 2 rooms, a shared reception area, and a window that faced actual trees. I had one full-time employee, a young analyst named Marcus, who had graduated from Fordham the previous spring and who processed information faster than anyone I had worked with before or since. I had 11 clients. Monthly recurring revenue was sitting at $47,000. I had not taken a salary above $68,000 in any of the 3 years prior. Because every dollar above that had gone back into the business, I was not comfortable yet. But I could see the shape of comfortable from where I was standing, which was more than I could have said 18 months earlier. The call came from a woman named Judith Crane. Judith was the CFO of a mid-size hedge fund called Arrowwood Capital, based in Greenwich, ironically, 7 minutes from the house I had grown up in. Arrowwood managed roughly $340 million in assets across 3 vehicles, and Judith had found Collins Meridian through a referral from Harrison Welch, who had apparently mentioned my name at a dinner party in Westport the previous month in a context I was not present for and could not have engineered. This is the thing about doing good work quietly. You cannot control when it surfaces or where, or in front of whom. You can only control the quality of what you leave behind. Judith was direct in the way that CFOs of a certain generation tend to be: no preamble, no social warm-up, just the situation and the question. Arrowwood was restructuring its family office advisory relationships. Their current firm had grown too large and too distracted. They wanted someone smaller, more attentive, with a specific fluency in multi-generational wealth transfer strategy. Harrison had said I was the best he had worked with at that kind of thinking. Was I available to meet? I said yes. I spent 4 days preparing for that meeting. I pulled every publicly available filing I could find related to Arrowwood's structure. I mapped their known asset classes against typical family office pain points in that AUM range. I built 3 scenario analyses, each one structured around a different version of what Judith might actually be trying to solve for. Because in my experience, what a client says they need in the first call is usually the surface of something deeper, and the advisor who finds the thing underneath is the one who keeps the relationship. I drove to Greenwich on a Tuesday morning in a suit I had bought specifically for the meeting. Charcoal gray, well cut, not flashy, and parked 2 blocks from the Arrowwood offices so I could walk the last stretch and arrive calm. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Judith asked hard questions. I answered them directly. When I did not know something, I said so, and then I explained how I would find out. At the 90-minute mark, she stopped taking notes and just looked at me for a moment, and I understood that the formal part of the meeting was over and something else was beginning. She said, "You're younger than I expected," I said. "I know. I also know what I'm doing." She smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that means something has been confirmed rather than discovered. 3 weeks later, Judith Crane signed a contract with Collins Meridian Advisors for an annual retainer of $2.1 million, covering comprehensive advisory services across all 3 of Arrowwood's family office vehicles. I was 25 years old. I sat in my car in the parking structure attached to the Arrowwood building and read the signed contract on my laptop screen and did not move for a long time. Outside, Greenwich looked exactly as it always had. The clean streets, the old money architecture, the particular quality of light on an October afternoon in Connecticut that makes everything look like it was designed to be looked at. I had grown up 20 from this parking structure. I had eaten Sunday dinners 4 miles from this building. I had been told, in this town, at a table set with good china, that I would be nothing. The contract in front of me was worth more in its first year than my father had earned in any single year of his career. I did not call anyone. There was no one in my family I wanted to tell, and the people I did want to tell, Marcus, Gerald Fitch, Harrison Welch, I would tell in the morning, in the ordinary way, because that was how I had decided to operate. Not in bursts of emotion, not in announcements, in the steady accumulation of evidence, but I sat there a little longer than necessary. I had found the weapon. Not a weapon made of anger or spite, or the need to prove something to people who had already decided what I was. Something quieter than that and more durable. I had built a thing that was real, that had clients and contracts, and a young analyst who showed up every morning and did excellent work. And the building of it had required exactly nothing from the people who had told me I could not do it without them. That was the moment I understood what the next 10 years were going to look like. Not revenge. Not yet, and maybe not ever. I did not know then how the story would turn. Just the steady, compounding satisfaction of a life constructed entirely on your own terms, brick by brick, in rooms that nobody gave you. I started the car and drove back to Stamford. Marcus had left a note on my desk that said, Judith Crane called to confirm receipt. She said, and I quote, "Tell Miss Collins we're looking forward to it." I read the note twice, then I put it in the top drawer of my desk, under the copy of my Series 65 certificate, and got back to work. 5 years of silence from Diana ended on a Thursday evening in March. I was in my car outside a restaurant in the Flatiron district, where I had just finished dinner with two prospective clients from a family office in New Jersey. The dinner had gone well. I had parked in a garage on 23rd Street, and I was sitting in the driver's seat reviewing notes on my phone before the drive back to Greenwich. I had moved the previous year into a townhouse 3 miles from where I grew up. Because I had earned the right to live wherever I wanted, and I had decided deliberately to live there, my phone lit up with a number I did not have saved. Connecticut area code. I answered. She said, "Haley, it's Diana." I recognized her voice immediately, the way you recognize a song you have not heard in years. The melody lands before the memory does. I sat with it for a moment. Then I said hello. She asked how I was. I said I was well. She said she had heard through Mom that I was doing really well with my firm, which meant my mother had been reporting on me to Diana, and they had discussed it, and Diana had decided this constituted an opening. I waited. Diana said she was calling because she wanted to catch up, and also she paused here, and I could hear her recalibrating. Because she was going through a bit of a transition with the firm. Things had been challenging, the market had shifted, a few key clients had moved on. She was restructuring. I knew what restructuring meant. I had watched enough businesses fail to recognize the language people use when they are not ready to say the actual word yet. She said she was wondering if I might be able to make some introductions. Her firm specialized in PR for financial services companies. It was a natural overlap with my client base. She thought there might be a real opportunity for a referral relationship, something mutually beneficial. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed, with a smoothness that almost conceals the rehearsal. I thought about the Thanksgiving table. I thought about the printed business plan with the crease down the middle. I thought about Edmund's house, and the parking lot, and the 3 jobs, and the $41,000 I had saved dollar by dollar in a spreadsheet I updated every Sunday night. I did not say any of that. I said, "Diana, my clients have existing communications relationships that I'm not in a position to disrupt. I don't think I'm the right person to help with this." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I'm not asking you to disrupt anything. I'm asking you to mention my name. That's it, one conversation," I said. "I understand." The answer is still no. Another pause. Longer this time, then her voice shifted. Not dramatically, not into cruelty, just into something cooler and more honest, which in its own way was worse. She said, "You know, I always thought once you got to where you wanted to be, you'd be less like this." I asked her what she meant by this. She said, "Closed off. Like you're still keeping score." I looked out through the windshield at the garage wall. There was a yellow line painted on the concrete at eye level, the kind that marks the height limit for tall vehicles. I had been looking at it for the length of the conversation without registering it. I said, "I'm not keeping score, Diana. I'm just not able to help." She said, "Fine." She said she hoped I was well. She said, "Give my best to Mom," as if I spoke to my mother the way she spoke to our mother, which I did not. We hung up. I sat in the garage for a few minutes. A car pulled in 2 spaces down, and a couple got out laughing about something, their voices bouncing off the concrete walls, and then gone. I had been prepared, in some version of myself, for that call to feel like something. For Diana's voice after 5 years to produce some reaction I would need to manage. But it had not. It had felt like a business call from someone whose firm was not a good fit, a routine conversation with a routine outcome. What I did not know, sitting in that garage, was that the call was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a sequence. 3 weeks later, my mother called and spent 40 minutes explaining Diana's situation to me in careful detail, the clients she had lost, the lease she could not renew, the line of credit that had reached its limit. My mother spoke about it the way she always spoke about Diana's difficulties, which was as if the difficulties had arrived from outside, like weather, rather than as consequences of specific decisions made by a specific person. I listened. I said I was sorry to hear things were hard. My mother said, "She could really use your help, Haley." I said, "I know, Mom." I did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say that would have landed correctly in that conversation, with that woman, about that subject. Some sentences exist only to be withheld. Then, 6 weeks after Diana's call, my father phoned. My father almost never called me. We had developed over the years a careful, infrequent correspondence. A birthday call, an occasional check-in that lasted under 10 minutes, a Christmas card with a signed note that said something general about hoping the year had been good. We had not built the kind of relationship where either of us asked for things. It had taken us both a long time to reach that arrangement, and I think we both found it workable. So when his name appeared on my phone on a Tuesday afternoon, I knew before I answered that something had shifted. He said, "Your sister needs help, Haley." "I know things between you two have been difficult, but she's family," I said. "I understand that," he said, "then act like it." I held the phone against my ear and looked at the wall of my office. The framed Series 65 certificate, a photo Marcus had taken at our 5-year anniversary dinner. The Arrowwood contract framed small and plain because I had wanted to remember it without making it a monument. I said, "I love you, Dad." But the answer is no. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said something I had not heard from him before. He said, "I think I may have made some mistakes with you, girls." It was the closest thing to an apology I had received from him in 32 years of being his daughter. It arrived too quietly and too late to change anything practical, but I kept it. I still have it, somewhere in the part of myself I do not examine too often. I said, "I know, Dad." We hung up. I turned back to my desk and pulled up the draft proposal I had been working on before the call. I sat there for a moment without reading it. Then I started reading. Diana's firm closed on a Friday in September. I did not find out from her. I found out from my mother, who called that evening with the particular quality of voice she reserved for news she had been holding for several hours and could not hold any longer, tight, controlled, the vocal equivalent of a sealed envelope. She said Diana had made the decision to wind down operations, that it had been a difficult few months, that Patrick had been very supportive. She said Diana was taking some time to regroup. I said I was sorry to hear it. My mother said, "I think she's going to be okay." "She's resilient," I said. "I know she is." We talked for 12 more minutes about other things, my Aunt Carol's hip replacement, a renovation my parents were doing on the back porch, and then we said goodbye and I set my phone down and went back to the proposal I had been reviewing before she called. I did not feel relief. I did not feel satisfaction. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a certain emotion in that moment, and I did not have it. What I felt was something closer to the absence of something. Like a sound you have been hearing for so long you stopped registering it, and then one day it stops, and the quiet is neither good nor bad, just different. What I did not know was that Diana was not regrouping, she was rebuilding. Or trying to. The first sign came 4 weeks later, through a source I had not expected. A woman named Claire Ashworth, who ran a small executive recruiting firm that I had used twice to fill senior analyst positions, called me on a Tuesday morning. Claire was not the kind of person who called without a reason. She said she had something a little unusual to pass along, and she hoped I would not find it strange that she was telling me. She said that a woman had contacted her firm looking for placement assistance, senior communications and client relations roles, financial services sector, Greenwich and Manhattan market. The woman's name was Diana Mercer. Claire had pulled her background and recognized the Collins name through the industry overlap with my firm. She had not made the connection publicly. She was simply flagging it, professionally, because she thought I might want to know that Diana was actively looking in my space. I thanked Claire. I told her I appreciated the call. After I hung up, I sat with that information for a while. Diana had been in PR for financial services firms for the better part of a decade. Her firm had failed, but the skill set was real. She was 44 years old with an extensive network in exactly the circles I operated in. She had changed her name when she married Patrick Mercer 3 years earlier, which meant her professional identity was now Diana Mercer, not Diana Collins. To anyone who did not know the history, she was simply a senior communications professional with relevant experience looking for her next role. I understood what was happening. Diana was not going away. She was reorienting. What happened next, I did not engineer. I want to be clear about that. I have told this story enough times in my own head to know where the line is between what I did and what simply occurred. And I am careful about that line because my own integrity requires it. What I did was this. I had already been planning, for several months, to open a director of client relations position at Collins Meridian. The firm had grown to a point, 31 clients, $40 million in annual recurring revenue, a staff of 9, where the gap between my capacity and the firm's needs had become a structural problem rather than a personal inconvenience. Marcus had moved into a VP role and was excellent at it. But the client-facing relationship management function had no dedicated senior leader, and I felt that absence every week in ways that were costing me time I could not afford to lose. I had a job description drafted. I had a salary range approved, $175, 0 to $185,000 base, plus performance bonus and equity participation. I had told Marcus we would open the posting in October. I moved the timeline up by 3 weeks, not because of Diana, because the need was real and the delay had already cost me. But I moved it, and the posting went live on a Monday morning publicly, through 3 industry job boards and our own careers page. I did not call Claire Ashworth back. I did not mention Diana's name to anyone on my team. I did not do anything except post a job that needed to be posted and go back to work. The rest I left to the ordinary mechanics of the world. Meanwhile, the calls from my family did not stop. My mother called twice in October. The first call was about Thanksgiving. Would I come this year? Diana would be there. Things were different now. She thought it would mean a lot. I said I would think about it, which was not a yes and was not meant to be. The second call was shorter. My mother said Diana was struggling, that the job market was harder than expected, that she had applied to several positions and not heard back. She said it in the careful way she said things she wanted me to infer something from without saying it directly. I said, I hope she finds something soon. Then Diana herself posted something on the family group chat, a message I saw because my mother had added me to it years ago and I had never removed myself, though I rarely looked at it. The message said she was exploring new opportunities and asked if anyone had leads in the financial services communications space. It was addressed to the family broadly, which meant it was addressed to me. I read it. I did not respond. 3 days later, a card arrived at my office. A physical card, handwritten, on heavy cream stationery. Diana's handwriting. I recognized the loops in the lowercase letters, the way she always made her D's slightly larger than the rest of the word. The card said she had heard about the director position at Collins Meridian. She said she knew things had been complicated between us. She said she believed she was genuinely qualified and that she hoped I would consider her. She signed it. Your sister, Diana. I read the card twice. I placed it in the top left drawer of my desk. Then I called my HR director, a meticulous woman named Sandra, and I asked her to confirm that all applications for the director role were being processed through the standard blind review protocol. No names shared with me until the first round interview stage. Sandra confirmed that yes, that was the process as designed. I said, good, keep it that way. I closed the drawer. I went back to work and I waited. With the particular patience of someone who has spent a decade learning that the most powerful thing you can do in any situation is exactly nothing, until the right moment arrives its own. The blind review process took 4 weeks. Sandra and her team screened 47 applications, conducted 12 preliminary phone screens, and advanced 6 candidates to the first formal interview round. I received the 6 candidate packets on a Monday morning in November, a single document per candidate, name and contact details on the cover page, work history and assessment notes inside. I opened the document on my laptop at my desk, coffee going cold beside me, the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass behind my monitor. Collins Meridian had moved the previous year into the 31st floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan. Not because I needed the address, but because the space was right and the lease terms were favorable, and because I had decided, when I signed the papers, that I was done apologizing for the size of what I had built. I opened the first candidate packet, read it, made notes second, third, fourth. The fifth candidate packet had a cover page that looked like the others. Name, current location, contact information, years of experience. I read the name first, the way you always read the name first, Deanna Mercer. Greenwich, Connecticut. I sat with it. Not with surprise exactly. Sandra's process had worked as designed. I had not known Diana was in the pool until this moment, which meant the preliminary screening had been conducted without any influence from me, conscious or otherwise. Diana had made it through 2 rounds of independent evaluation on the merits of her application. That fact was not nothing. I read her packet the way I read the others, carefully, without rushing. Her background was genuine, 14 years in financial services communications, a client roster that had at its peak included 4 mid-size hedge funds and 2 family offices in the Northeast. The failure of her firm was noted plainly in her cover letter, with a directness I had not expected. She wrote that the firm had been undercapitalized through its final 18 months and that she had made decisions she would have made differently with the benefit of hindsight, and that the experience had clarified for her exactly what she was good at and where she needed to operate within a larger structure rather than leading one. It was the most honest thing I had ever seen Diana produce in writing. I finished reading. I set the packet down. I picked up my coffee, which was cold, and drank it anyway. Then I called Sandra and confirmed the interview schedule. 6 candidates over 2 days. Diana Mercer was slotted for Tuesday at 2 o'clock. I did not tell Sandra anything. There was nothing to tell that was relevant to the process. If Diana's application had not passed the blind screening, I would never have seen her name, and the story would have ended there, in an HR database, quietly, without drama. But it had passed, and my integrity required that I treat what had passed as what it was, a qualified candidate who had earned the right to sit across a table from me. What happened between that Monday and Tuesday afternoon I will tell plainly. I slept normally. I worked normally. On Monday evening, I had dinner with Marcus at a restaurant near the office that we had been going to since the early Stamford days, a habit we had carried through every version of the firm, a standing check-in that had become less formal meeting and more genuine friendship over the years. Marcus knew about Diana. He knew the broad shape of it, not because I had told him strategically, but because he had been with me long enough to have heard pieces and assembled them. He asked, over his pasta, if I was ready for Tuesday. I said, I've been ready for 10 years. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, what are you going to do? I said, my job. He nodded and poured more wine, and we talked about other things, and that was the right amount of conversation to have about it. Tuesday morning, I arrived at the office at 7:30. I reviewed all 6 candidate packets again. I prepared a standard question set, the same questions for every candidate, sequenced the same way, scored on the same rubric. I had Sandra confirm that the conference room was set. The long table, the 6 chairs, the water, the clean whiteboard. I had asked that the interviewer's position be at the head of the table, which was not the standard setup. Sandra had noted it without comment and arranged it accordingly. The first candidate came in at 9. She was strong, a former VP at a mid-size asset manager, precise and well-prepared. I scored her an 81. The second came in at 10:30, also strong. 84 third at noon, 77 fourth at 1, 80. I ate lunch at my desk. A sandwich Marcus had left outside my door, without being asked, because he knew the schedule, and he was that kind of person. I ate half of it, read through my notes on the morning's candidates, and then set everything aside and looked out at the city for a few minutes. It was a gray November day, the kind that makes Manhattan look like a black and white photograph of itself. I could see the park from where I sat, the last of the autumn color almost gone, the trees going bare and clean and architectural against the sky. At 1:58, I walked to the conference room. I sat at the head of the table. I placed my notepad to my left and my pen parallel to it. I set Diana's packet face down in front of me. I poured a glass of water and took one drink and set it down. At 2 o'clock exactly, Sandra opened the door. Diana walked in. She was dressed well. A navy suit I did not recognize, good shoes. Hair up in a low knot, the way she had always worn it for important occasions. She was carrying a leather portfolio sucked, and she walked with the particular posture of someone who has prepared thoroughly and is working to project more certainty than they feel. She looked at the chair across from me and pulled it out and sat down. She set her portfolio on the table. She folded her hands, then she looked up. Her eyes moved from my hands to the notepad to the pen to my face. And I watched the exact moment it happened. The moment the prepared version of Diana Mercer, the candidate with the polished portfolio and the rehearsed answers, encountered something her preparation had not accounted for. Her face did not collapse. I will give her that. It went still, which is different. A stillness that cost her something. I looked at her steadily and said, "Good afternoon. Thank you for coming in." She said nothing for a moment. Her hands, still folded on the table, tightened slightly. Then she said, very quietly, "Haley." I picked up my pen. I wrote the date and her name at the top of my notepad in my standard format, the way I had done for the 4 candidates before her. Then I looked up. "Ms. Collins," I said, "and I'm afraid this interview is concluded. I want to tell you exactly what happened in the 30 seconds after I said those words, because I have replayed them more times than I can count, and I think the detail matters." Diana did not stand up immediately. She sat with it for a moment, the way a person sits with something that has landed before the full weight of it has registered. Her hands were still folded on the table. The leather portfolio was still closed in front of her. The water glass I had poured for her was untouched. Then she said, "You knew. It was not a question." I said, "Your application passed blind screening. I did not know your name was in the pool until Monday morning when I received the candidate packets." She looked at me. I could see her processing that, testing it against what she knew of me, against the version of me she had constructed over 10 years of distance. I watched her decide whether to believe it. She said, "But you didn't remove me." She said, "No." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because you earned the interview. That's how the process works." Another silence, longer than the first. Outside the conference room glass, I could see Sandra at her desk, head down, working. 2 of my analysts were visible through the interior window of the main office floor, moving between desks. The building hummed with the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday afternoon: HVAC, distant elevator, someone's phone. Diana looked at the table. Then she looked back at me. She said, "So that's it. That's the whole thing." I said, "I'm sorry," she said. "You're going to sit there and tell me you let me get this far just to tell me it's concluded. That's your—" She stopped herself. I watched her stop herself, which required visible effort. I said, "Diana, the interview is concluded because I cannot be your hiring manager. You're my sister. That's a conflict of interest I'm not willing to have inside my firm. It has nothing to do with anything else." She looked at me for a long moment, then she said quietly, "Nothing to do with Thanksgiving." I said, "I didn't say that." The room was very still. I picked up her packet from the table, face down still, the way I had placed it, and I slid it across to her. Not pushed, not thrown. Placed with 2 fingers and slid. She looked at it. She did not pick it up immediately. I said, "Your application was strong. Your cover letter was the most honest document I have read from a candidate in 2 years. Sandra will reach out today to let you know the interview has been withdrawn from consideration, and the reason on file will be conflict of interest. Nothing negative, nothing that follows you." She picked up the packet. She looked at the cover page for a moment. Her own name printed there, Diana Mercer. The name she had built a second version of herself around, and something moved across her face that I did not have a name for. Not grief, exactly, not humiliation. Something more complicated than either of those, something that had been a long time arriving. Then she stood up. She was composed. I had expected composure from her, and I got it, which told me that whatever was happening inside her was happening in a register she was not going to let me see. That was her right. I did not need to see it. She picked up her portfolio. She straightened her jacket with one hand, the small automatic gesture of a person re-answering themselves. She said, "You built something real." I said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't think you would." I said, "I know." She looked at me one more time, not the way she had looked at me across the Thanksgiving table, 22 years old, and full of certainty, but something different, something that had the quality of a long and difficult recalculation. Then she walked to the door and opened it and walked out. I heard her heels on the floor of the main office. A clean, measured sound that crossed the room and reached the elevator bank and then stopped. I heard the elevator arrive. I heard the doors open and close. Then there was nothing. I sat at the head of the conference table in the quiet that followed and did not move for a moment. Sandra appeared in the doorway, after a minute, notepad in hand, face professionally neutral in the way of someone who had been in proximity to something significant and had chosen to process it later. She said, "The last candidate is here whenever you're ready," I said. "Give me 5 minutes." She nodded and closed the door. I sat in the conference room alone. The city was still gray outside. The water glasses were still on the table, both of them untouched. Diana's had a faint lipstick mark on the rim from when she must have touched it to her mouth before I noticed. I had not seen her drink from it, but the mark was there. I looked at it for a moment. I thought about the Thanksgiving table. The centerpiece Diana had made from branches in the backyard. The way the candlelight had made her look like a version of herself that was performing being herself. The folded napkin I had left beside my plate, the driveway, the drive to Stamford, Edmund's house, and the parking lot, and the clicking radiator, and the jar of hard candies on the counter. I thought about Gerald Fitch in his brown cardigan, handing me 3 names on a piece of paper without fanfare. I thought about Harrison Welch saying he was tired of being handled. I thought about Judith Crane's small smile. Something confirmed rather than discovered. I thought about 14 months of 3 jobs, and 6 hours of sleep, and a spreadsheet updated every Sunday night. I thought about the signed Arrowwood contract on my laptop screen in a parking structure 7 minutes from where I grew up. And I thought about the fact that Diana, at 40 years old, had walked into this building and applied for a job at a company built by the sister she had told would be nothing, and that she had done it under a different name, and that the application had been strong, and that the cover letter had been honest. And that none of that had been enough to change what this room required of me. It was not the ending I had imagined when I was 22 years old driving out of that driveway. I had imagined something louder, something with more witnesses, something where I said the right thing and the room understood. This was quieter than that, and it was mine in a way that the loud version never would have been. I poured the untouched water from Diana's glass into mine. I drank it. I stood up and straightened my jacket the way she had straightened hers, which I did not notice I was doing until after I had done it. Then I opened the conference room door and told Sandra to send in the last candidate. The last candidate's name was Renee Okafor. She was 38 years old, formerly a senior director of client strategy at a wealth management firm in Boston. And she walked into the conference room with the particular energy of someone who had been waiting for the right room their entire career and suspected this might be it. She was prepared without being rehearsed. She answered my questions directly and asked 3 of her own that demonstrated she had read everything publicly available about Collins Meridian and had thought carefully about what the firm actually needed rather than what she wanted to offer. I scored her a 91. After she left, I sat alone in the conference room for another 10 minutes writing up my notes, and by the time walked back to my office, I knew we had found our director of client relations. I told Marcus that evening. He read my score sheet and said, "It's not close." I said, "No, it's not." We made Renee an offer the following week. She accepted within 24 hours. What happened after Diana left the building that Tuesday afternoon unfolded the way consequences tend to unfold. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of smaller ones that accumulated into something irreversible. Diana called my mother from the parking garage before she had even left the block. I know this because my mother called me at 4:17 that same afternoon, while I was still at my desk finishing the day's work. Her voice was different from the usual tight enveloped quality. It was something rawer than that, something that had the sound of a woman encountering a version of her own history she had managed, until now, to keep at a comfortable distance. She said, "Diana told me what happened." I said, "Okay," she said. "She said you dismissed her." I said, "I concluded the interview due to conflict of interest. That's a standard professional determination." A long silence. Then my mother said something I had not heard from her in 32 years of being her daughter. She said, "I should have said something, at Thanksgiving, when she said what she said to you. I should have said something, and I didn't. And I have thought about that many times." I sat with that. It arrived the way my father's near apology had arrived, too quietly, and too late to change anything structural but real. More real, in fact, than most of what had been said in that family over many years. I said, "I know, Mom," she said. "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes. I've been all right for a long time." We talked for 20 more minutes, which was longer and more honest than any conversation we had managed in the previous decade. She told me she was proud of me. She said it plainly, without qualification, without the softening addendum that usually followed any acknowledgement of my achievements in that family. The but Diana also, or the in her own way that had always arrived to redistribute the weight. Just, "I am proud of you." I told her I would come for Thanksgiving. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Really?" I said, "Yes. But just us, just the family." She understood what I meant, she said. "Of course." After we hung up, I looked out at the city. The gray had lifted sometime in the late afternoon, while I had been in the conference room, and the last of the day's light was coming in low and pale gold over the buildings to the west. Manhattan at that hour has a particular quality of light that I have never seen anywhere else, something to do with the water on three sides and the way the grid channels the sun, and I had spent enough years in that office to know it well. But it struck me that evening with the force of something new. Diana, I learned over the following weeks, did not take the conflict of interest explanation at face value. She told the story, or a version of it, to several people in their Greenwich social circle. The version she told positioned herself as having been ambushed, as having walked into a situation designed to humiliate her. She told it at a dinner party. She told it to a woman who sat on the board of a local charitable organization where several of my clients were also involved. The story did not land the way Diana intended. What she had not accounted for was that the financial services community in Greenwich and Lower Fairfield County is smaller and more interconnected than it appears from the outside, and that Collins Meridian had spent a decade building a reputation in that community that was not going to be dislodged by a dinner party anecdote. 3 people who heard Diana's version of events called or emailed me within the following 2 weeks, not to warn me exactly, but in the way that people reach out when they want to register that they know the shape of the truth and are not confused by a contrary version of it. Harrison Welch sent a 2-line email. "Heard something at the club last week. I want you to know it didn't move the needle for anyone who matters." "Proud of what you've built," I replied. "Thank you, Harrison." Dinner soon. Diana's husband Patrick, I heard through my mother, had grown increasingly distant in the months following the firm's closure. He had his own career pressures. His firm had been through a merger that had not been kind to his position. And the combination of Diana's professional collapse and the aftermath of the interview had put a strain on the marriage that was visible to everyone around them. By February, they had separated. My mother told me this during one of our now regular Sunday evening calls, a habit we had built slowly over the months since Thanksgiving, carefully, without forcing it into a shape it was not ready for. She said it matter-of-factly, not as news designed to produce a reaction from me. She said Diana was staying in the Greenwich house for the time being and was in therapy, which she said with a tentative hopefulness that I recognized as my mother allowing herself, at 71 years old, to believe that the people she loved were capable of change. I said I was glad Diana was getting support. My mother said, "She asked about you. She wanted to know if you'd be willing to talk." I looked at the window. The February light in Manhattan is thin and honest. "It does not flatter anything, just illuminates," I said. "Not yet," my mother said. Okay, she did not push. That was new, and I noticed it, and it was one of the small, quiet things that made Thanksgiving feel like it might actually happen the way I had said it would. My father called me on my birthday in February, as he always did. But the call lasted 45 minutes instead of the usual 10. He asked about the firm. He asked about Marcus. He asked what I was reading. He sounded older than I remembered him sounding, which he was, and also somehow less defended, which was something else. Near the end of the call, he said, "That business plan you showed me. At Thanksgiving, do you still have it?" I said, "I remember every line of it." Then he said, "It was a good plan," I said. "Yes, it was." Another silence. "The comfortable kind," which was new between us. He said, "Happy birthday, Haley." I said, "Thanks, Dad." 18 months after Diana walked out of my conference room, I hired Renee Okafor's replacement. Not because Renee had left. She had not. She was by that point one of the best hires I had ever made, a fact that Marcus confirmed regularly, and that our client retention numbers confirmed even more reliably. I hired a second director because the firm had grown again, meaningfully, in the way that growth happens when you have the right people in the right seats and you stop managing around gaps and start building on foundations. Collins Meridian closed the fiscal years at $67 million in annual recurring revenue. We had 44 clients, a staff of 17, and a waiting list for new client intake that I had instituted not as a marketing strategy, but as a practical reality. There were only so many relationships we could manage with integrity, and integrity was the only thing I had ever built the firm around. I was 33 years old. I tell you those numbers not to perform success at you, the way some people perform success, as a kind of argument, a retroactive proof against everyone who ever doubted them. I tell you because the numbers are the most honest way I know to describe what 10 years of the specific kind of work I did actually produces. Not luck, not connection, not borrowed capital from a father who believed in one daughter more than the other. Work, compounded over time, in rooms nobody gave me. The Thanksgiving I had promised my mother happened. It was the second Thanksgiving after the interview. The first one I had gone home had been careful, tentative, like a newly repaired thing being tested for the first time under ordinary weight. We had kept to safe subjects. My mother had made the standing rib roast, and it had smelled exactly as it always had, and I had sat at the table in the house I grew up in and eaten it without performing anything. Diana had not been there. My father had been quieter than usual and had refilled my wine twice without being asked, which was its own kind of language. The second Thanksgiving was different. Diana came. I had said yes when my mother asked carefully, whether I thought it would be all right. I had thought about it for 3 days before answering. I had talked to no one about it except myself. In the way you talk to yourself when you are trying to determine what you actually believe, rather than what you want to believe. What I believed was this. Diana had done damage, real damage, the kind that does not unhappen simply because time has passed or circumstances have shifted. I was not going to pretend otherwise, and I was not going to manufacture a warmth I did not feel for the purpose of making a family dinner comfortable. I had spent too many years refusing to perform things I did not mean to start now. But I also believed that the woman who had walked into my conference room and written that cover letter, honest, plainly self-aware, willing to name her own failures in a professional document intended to represent her at her best, was not the same woman who had said what she had said at the Thanksgiving table 11 years earlier. People change, not always, not on demand, but sometimes, when circumstances remove the scaffolding they have been leaning on long enough, they find out what they are actually made of and make adjustments accordingly. Deanna was in therapy. She had taken a position at a mid-sized PR agency in Stamford, not her own firm, not a senior title, just a solid roles at a functioning organization where she was, by all accounts I heard through my mother, doing well. She had moved out of the Greenwich house after the divorce was finalized and was renting an apartment in Norwalk. She was building something from a lower floor than she had occupied before, and she was doing it without our father's money and without Patrick's last name, and without the architecture of the golden child identity that had organized her entire adult life. I understood something about that process. She arrived at my parents' house at noon, 40 minutes before I did. When I walked in, she was in the kitchen, helping my mother with something at the counter, and she turned when she heard the door, and we looked at each other across the kitchen, in the house we had both grown up in. She said, "Hi," I said, "Hi." My mother kept her eyes on the counter. We did not hug. We did not make a scene of it in either direction. We sat at the same table and ate the same meal, and talked carefully about small things, her new apartment, a client I mentioned without details, the renovation my parents had finally finished on the back porch. My father asked me questions about the firm and listened to the answers with an attention he had not given me at that table when I was 22 and asking for $15,000 and a little faith. After dinner, Diana and I ended up on the back porch, alone for a few minutes while parents were inside. It was cold. The yard looked the way it always looked in November: bare trees, gray light, the particular stillness of a property that has absorbed decades of a family's ordinary life. She said, "I've thought about what I said. A lot," I said. "I know," she said. "I don't think I can apologize in a way that covers it," I said. "You don't have to cover it. You just have to mean it." She looked at the yard for a moment. Then she said, "I meant it. I'm sorry, Haley." I looked at her. She was 44 years old and she looked it, in the way that people start to look their age when they stop managing their appearance as a professional asset and just exist in it. There were lines around her eyes that had not been there at the Thanksgiving table 11 years ago. Her hair was down, which she had not worn down in years as far as I could remember. She looked, for the first time in my memory, like herself. I said, "I know you are." We went back inside. We did not become close that winter. I want to be honest about that, because the story people want is the full reconciliation, the restoration of the sisterly bond, the Hallmark version, where the damage is repaired as cleanly as it was inflicted. That is not what happened. What happened was something quieter and more durable, a slow accumulation of small, honest interactions over the following year. A phone call here, a text message there. Coffee once, in Stamford on a Saturday morning when I happened to be in the area. Two women in their 30s, sitting at a table in an ordinary coffee shop, talking about their lives without performing anything for the other. It was not what we had been. It was something we had not been before, which in some ways was better. My mother called me on a Sunday evening in the spring after that second Thanksgiving. She was in the garden. I could tell from the background sound, birds, a slight wind, the acoustic quality of being outdoors. She said she just wanted to check in. We talked about nothing in particular for 20 minutes. Near the end of the call, she said, "I'm glad you came back," I said. "Me too, Mom," she said. "She's going to be okay, you know." "Diana," I said. "I know. So am I." My mother laughed, a small, real laugh, the kind that is not performing happiness, but just expressing it. I had not heard that laugh from her in a long time. I was in my townhouse in Greenwich when she called, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold. Through the window I could see the street. An ordinary suburban street. Quiet, on a Sunday evening, a neighbor's dog crossing the end of the driveway, the last of the day's light moving up the trunks of the trees, 7 minutes from Arrowwood Capital. 4 miles from the house, with the good china and the centerpiece made of branches. 11 years from the driveway, and the drive to Stamford, and the room above the parking lot, and the radiator that clicked for 20 minutes before it produced any actual heat. I sat there after the call ended and did not move for a while. I thought about what it cost to build something real. Not the financial cost. I knew that arithmetic precisely. In a spreadsheet I still had saved somewhere. The other cost. The decade of Sunday evenings updating numbers in a quiet room. The 3 jobs and the 6 hours of sleep. The calls I did not return, and the dinners I did not attend, and the relationships I did not build because I was building something else instead. I thought about whether I would do it again the same way. I thought, yes, without hesitation, not because the cost was small, but because what I built with it was mine in a way that nothing given to me could ever have been. And I thought about Diana, walking out of my conference room with her leather portfolio and her composed face and the lipstick mark on the water glass she had barely touched. She had said, "You built something real." I had said, "Yes." That was the truest exchange we had ever had. 2 sentences, no performance in either direction. Just the plain acknowledgement of a fact that had taken 11 years and considerable pain to arrive at. I finished my tea. I washed the cup. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. In the morning, I went back to work. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is not about revenge. Revenge was never the point. The point was never to make Diana feel what she had made me feel. The point was to build something so real and so entirely mine that the opinion of anyone who had doubted me would become, eventually, structurally irrelevant. You cannot control what people say about you at a table. You cannot control who gets the money and who gets the handshake at the door. You cannot control the family system you are born into, or the role it assigns you before you are old enough to refuse it. What you can control is what you do with the drive to Stamford. What you do with the room above the parking lot. What you do with the $11 an hour and the man in the brown cardigan who looks at your brain and does not seem confused by what he finds there. Build the thing. Build it quietly, without announcement, without the need for anyone's permission or anyone's witness. Build it on Sunday evenings when no one is watching. Build it in the accumulation of small, honest choices that no one will ever see but that will be visible, eventually, in everything. And if someone once told you that you would be nothing without them, let the work answer. Let it answer completely and at scale and in rooms they will have to walk into on their own 2 feet and sit across from what you have become. That is enough. That has always been enough. If this story felt like something you have lived, leave me a comment below and tell me where you are watchifying from. If you have ever been written off by the people who were supposed to believe in you, and you kept going anyway, I want to hear from you. Hit like if this reached you. Subscribe if you want to hear what happened next, because there is always a next.